Welcome to the In His Grip podcast with Dr. Chuck F. Betters, produced by Mark Inc. Ministries. Let's join Dr. Betters in the sanctuary as he preaches the series, Building a Spiritual Legacy.
Chapter headings are not inspired. Keep reading. Verse 1 of chapter 22. David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their leader. About 400 men were with him. Now, a lot happens in the interim. A lot has to be filtered through between the lines here. It is usually, as I said, on the heels of some great spiritual victory that we are most prone to an assault. An all-out assault on the soul by the enemy of our souls. In a sermon I preached some time ago on this particular passage in David's life, I entitled that message, Regaining Your Spiritual Compass, because you see, David had lost his. In the previous chapter of 1 Samuel, let me paint the picture for you. David flees to Naioth, which was where the seminary of the prophets was. And he was escaping there because of the murderous plot of Saul to kill him. In the process of that flight to Naioth, he loses his soul friend, Jonathan. He loses his position of power and respect. He loses even his marriage. Now he is going to lose his spiritual mentor, Samuel. And there's an intriguing series of divine invasions at Naioth as God strikes down the hitmen who were there to kill him from Saul. And he even causes those enemies of David to bow down and worship God. Had he waited with Samuel, had he waited for a word from the Lord from Samuel, had he waited patiently and not taken matters into his own hands, the same God who had already told him he would not die and that he would become the king would have spoken to him again. You see, God told David, you will not die at the hands of Saul. You will become the king. And what does David do? He runs for his life. He conjures up a scheme with his best friend, Jonathan. Jonathan, who was the son of Saul, does not believe that his father is out to kill David. He's not convinced that his father is the madman that David says he is. So there's a feast day, a celebration taking place, and David is absent from the feast. Now Saul threw this party at the feast because he was expecting David to come. And when David would come, he was going to have him assassinated. David sensed that Saul was out to kill him and refused to come to the feast, but rather than trust God, he told a lie. He conjured up a lie. And not only that, he concocted a scheme. He says to Jonathan, you go in and talk to your dad. And you sense from him whether or not he's out to kill me. And if you sense that I'm in danger, we'll have a prearranged signal, and I'll be watching from the distance. You signal me if you think he's going to kill me, and I'll run for my life. You signal me if he's going to be kind to me, and I'll come in. Jonathan says, I don't want to have anything to do with this. I don't believe my dad is out to kill you. But he agrees because he's a friend. And Jonathan goes in and becomes a companion to David's lie. Jonathan became convinced that Saul was out to kill him when Jonathan mentioned David's name and his father took a spear and threw it at him and almost impaled him against the wall. I guess he was convinced. And their prearranged signal went out and David fled again for his life because he knew now that Saul was obsessed with killing him. He warns David, David runs, and David's needs are now quite critical. He would dare not travel by day because he would be seen by Saul, and he dared not travel by night because it was dangerous to travel by night. There was a little town called Nob, about an hour southeast of Gibeah, where Saul lived. It was there where the tabernacle was erected, the precursor to the temple. After David left Jonathan, he laid in hiding all night long. He appears the next day before the high priest Ahimelech in Nob. Ahimelech sees him coming and fears for his own life because he knew there were wanted posters all over the place. Ahimelech is celebrating the Sabbath. He has the 12 loaves of bread laid out there that were the pay, if you will, for his services. David comes in and he says, do you have any food? And by consulting or by engaging Ahimelech, he is now endangering Ahimelech's life and his own son Abiathar. He says, do you have anything to eat here? He says, well, I've only got these 12 loaves of bread, but they're for temple use and temple use only. But he convinces Ahimelech to give him the bread. He appears before Ahimelech and asks him to help him out. This is what lying always does. Lying fundamentally can be regarded or defined this way. Lying is saying, I just don't believe in the promises of God. That's why we lie. We lie because we do not trust God. We do not trust God to tell the truth. We do not trust God to make it, even if we're endangered. We don't trust God to tell the truth. So we lie. Lying is a form of control. It's a form of manipulation. David is now broadening the base of his lies because he has lost hope. And when you lose hope, friends, you lose. He certainly wondered at all that God had promised him. I am sure he wondered if he was handling his situation as a believer should. Do you ever feel that way? As though the promises of God are shallow? Have you ever questioned his love in particular for you? Especially when the dealings in your life clash with his love? How can a God who loves me this much allow me to be hurt this bad? You ever been where David is? Sometimes do you feel as though the promises of the Bible actually mock you? When you read what God claims about himself and claims about how we should trust him, do you ever read those promises and they seem to mock? You sing songs like, He is my hiding place. I will trust in you. And you know deep down in your spirit, you're not trusting in him and you don't plan to. David is left to a choice. Either I submit to the truth and to the promise that God told me I would not die and that I would be king, or I take matters into my own hands and I control the situation. I lie to Jonathan. I lie to Saul. I manipulate Ahimelech. I endanger Abiathar. I gather the bread from the temple and I control things. I run for my life and I make sure I'm protected. In fact, David needed two things, food and a weapon. So he concocts a lie. He says, my troops are outside. There were no troops. He had no troops. He was alone, as we often find ourselves. He was by himself. He was holding tight to control and manipulation. So he tells Ahimelech, I need the bread for my troops. What he really needed the bread for was his planned escape. He says, and I need a weapon. I lost mine. Interesting, 1 Samuel chapter 21, the soap opera gets even better. 1 Samuel 21 verse 7 says, now one of Saul's servants was there that day. I call him the snitch. Doeg the Edomite was the snitch. You can almost see him hiding in the bushes. He's there while this little exchange is going on. Satan always will have his demons close by when we are about to sin. And when we don't tell the truth, Satan will. He'll shout a lie from the housetops and teach others that it is the truth. And here is David, and he's about to lie again. Now, one of Saul's servants was there that day, detained before the Lord. He was Doeg the Edomite. Don't brush over that detained before the Lord thing. That's an interesting phrase. It seems as though God desired this man to be there. He's about to unmask David's lie. Verse 8, David asked Ahimelech, don't you have a spear or a sword here? I haven't brought my sword or any other weapon because the king's business was urgent. I had to leave quickly. I forgot my sword. I'm on king's business here. You see what he's doing? He's lying through his teeth. The priest replied, well, the only sword I got here is the sword of Goliath, the giant that you killed in the valley of Elam. You would think at that point a light bulb would have gone on in David's mind. You would think at that point from the mouth of Ahimelech that when he said that to David, David would have clicked on the light bulb and said, oh my, wait a minute, what am I doing here? What's going on? By the power of God, I killed the giant. Now I'm standing here lying. He says, if you want to take it, there is no sword here but that one. David said, there is none like it. Give it to me. But David, there is a sword like it. There is a sword much more powerful than it is. A slingshot, armed by the faith of a shepherd boy and by the power of an awesome God. You see, David, you've lost your spiritual compass. You have a severe case of spiritual amnesia. You not only have forgotten the promises of God, but you have forgotten the faithfulness of God with which he so graciously has delivered you. David is about to do the unthinkable. After all of this, he's lost his friend Jonathan. He's lost his marriage. He endangers the life of the high priest. He steals the bread. He lies about getting the sword. He does not trust God. He plays the madman, the unthinkable. He goes to the camp of the enemy to get comfort. If this is the way these Christians are going to treat me, I should just go ahead where the enemies are. I'll find more comfort in the world than I find in my church. You ever think that way? I'll just go and sell out. When he gets there, he realizes he's in big trouble. So he concocts another scheme. He's now going to play the madman. He's now going to scratch at the door like a dog and foam at the mouth so that no one will touch him, so that others will think he's not a threat, that he's just lost his mind. You see, friends, this is where we choose independence to accountability. Achish is Goliath's king. David is now at the height of spiritual insanity. This is where we actually prefer the company of the unbeliever and his acceptance of us more than we do the values of the church, the fellowship of the body, and the fellowship of the Spirit. Even Achish knows this is abnormal behavior, and he wants to have nothing to do with him. So once again, David runs for his life, and all of it has been perpetuated by deceit and lies. It was after his escape from Gath that he comes like Osama bin Laden to a cave out in the wilderness in a place called Adullam. It was there David wrote the 34th Psalm. What lessons did he learn by pretending madness? You see, the stage is now set for this man after God's own heart to unpack his pain and to allow us a glimpse into the miraculous recovery of lost faith. By the way, if you take a little glimpse into what happens at the end of this episode, you see in Psalm 34 God's mercy at its best. All of the disenfranchised in 1 Samuel 22, verse 2, all of the poor, all of the disenfranchised, all of the distressed came to him there. About 400 men were with him. In spite of what David did, in spite of the lies, in spite of the deceit, in spite of the spiritual amnesia, God would raise up an army for David, the 400 mighty warriors of faith that formed the core of David's massive army that he would soon develop. But something happened between 1 Samuel 21:1 and 1 Samuel 21:2, Because you see in 1 Samuel 22:1, it says David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. But then it tells us his brothers came to him and the mighty army was formed. Something happened between those two events. While David was in the cave and before his men came to him, David wrote Psalm 34. You see, David wasn't going to receive that army until he recovered from his amnesia, until he could trust in the blessings of God again. You ever been there? You know where it begins? You know where the recovery begins? Where it began with David. Now to Psalm 34, take a look at it. It says, of David when he pretended to be insane before Abimelech, who drove him away and he left. By the way, this is an alphabetical psalm. Each verse begins with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet, save one, so that it could be memorized and sung. You see, the lessons to be taught to children was important. And this psalm was to be taught to the kids. It was to be learned. This is the way out. This is how the blessings are restored. This is how you wrestle with God. This is where it begins. And the first place is to worship. That's where you begin. When you've developed spiritual amnesia, when you've become blind, when you can't hear anymore, when the voice of God seems to be afar off, when you don't hear the blessings being poured out upon you, you don't see them anymore, and God seems to be a million miles away, when you're in that dark tunnel, when you're funneling your way down into that valley of despair, the first place you need to go is to worship. He says, I will extol the Lord at all times. I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise will always be on my lips.
Thank you for listening. For the complete sermon, please visit markinc.org and click In His Grip. Join Dr. Chuck F. Betters in the sanctuary from Monday to Friday on the In His Grip podcast.